Hello, my fellow barbarians, and welcome to the very first episode of the official Conan the Barbarian podcast. Today's guest needs a little introduction. I mean, he was one of the first creatives to really tell Conan stories in a visual format. So we've got a lot to talk about today, and you're going to really enjoy this one. It's an absolute treat. Please welcome to the show the man, the myth, the legend, Roy Thomas.
Well, first of all, I think you give me a little too much, credit. Obviously, the main thing with there's only one person really important to Conan ever. That was Robert E. Howard. All the rest of us are just hangers-on. We were popularizers. Arnold Schwarzenegger could make him, sort of come to life for a while or something, and I could write about him, or Sprague could write about him, or new people could write about him, or draw him, or whatever. But it's all back to that same basic work, Robert E. Howard, as essential to that as, say, Edgar Rice Burroughs to Tarzan or anything like that. As far as how we did it, did you want to tell you the story, basically? I mean,
yeah, that'd be amazing. Please tell us.
Well, it was a weird thing. It kind of snuck up on me and on Marvel and everything. I really didn't know anything about Conan, didn't know the word or anything. But one day I'm in a bookstore in New York City, I think on 2nd Avenue, and I see, as always, checking out the paperbacks and books and things, and I see this guy there with a sword, the girl clinging to his leg, and there's skull motif, and there's bodies all around. It was just a knock you off your chair kind of scene. So I buy it, I take it home, and I read a few pages. It's well written. It just, it didn't exactly grab me. The writing was good, but I was looking for something a little different. So I never read past the first 5 or 10 pages, and then I put it on a shelf, Other books came out over the next year or so mostly with Rosetta covers. There were a couple that didn't, but I bought them all for the covers mostly. Still didn't read them for a while. But in the meantime, the readers at Marvel, as there got to be more and more of these sword and sorcery books out, some readers said you should do Conan, but more of them were just saying you should do one of these sword and sorcery characters. And Stan, for some reason, instead of deciding to make up a character, he decided he sort of took them seriously and said, well, the readers seem to think we should license one of these characters. What do you think? And by that time, I'd started reading Conan. I suddenly realized over the period of 2 or 3 stories that this was the real deal. There was a power and a passion beneath that writing that the imitators didn't really have because they were just kind of, doing stories. But I still didn't know much about it. And Stan said, well, listen, I want you, he says, to write a memo for the publisher, Martin Goodman, to license a character to do him in a comic book, because that was not Marvel's, usual way. They usually made up a character. So I said, okay. I said, I'll do that, I told him about Thongor and Conan, and by then I had read some of the color stories, which had come out in the one volume with the Roy Krinkle cover. And he said, said, well, the name I like best is Thongor, that's a comic book type name, and I think you like Ko better than Conan too, because, a K is a strong letter and a C really isn't, So we said, okay, we'll go after Thongor. Lynn Carter liked the idea of Thongor getting the comics. He rather liked comics himself, so he thought it would be kind of fun. So he okayed it. His agent hated the idea because 10% of $150 an issue is $15. He's going to get $15 an issue. He's treading water, backpedaling, trying to sort of wait us out and see if we'll make another offer, up it a little bit. He did not know Martin Goodman. He did not know that this was Martin Goodman's final offer, I just sat there waiting and getting frustrated, and Stan would ask, what's wrong? Any movement on that Thongor thing? And, and said, oh, no, haven't heard from him. Lynn can't do it. The agent has got to do it. So one night, Conan of Samaria, was that the name of it? The one with the Frost Giant's daughter cover. I always skipped the introductions that the camp wrote because, I didn't want to read about the character. I wanted to read the stories. And I suddenly read it, and it's just a few pages about the thing. It's not that informative, but when he gets to the end, he mentions that the literary agent of the Robert E. Howard estate is a guy named Glenn Lord who lives in Pasadena, Texas, and he puts his address in there. Well, you put somebody's address in there, it's like asking them to contact him. He's the agent for the estate. I don't know if he represents Conan or not, but he's the agent for the Robert E. Howard estate. So I just sat down that night or the next morning or whatever and wrote a letter, sent it off to Pasadena, Texas, saying, we haven't got too much money to offer, but, it might put Conan into a new market, by seeing the comic readers, it might help the paperback sales. We haven't got much to offer. And I was so embarrassed by the $150. It was, so little even in the time that I upped it to $200 on my own. It was a 33% increase, right? And the thing is, Glenn accepted right away. He didn't have the right to give away to have us do the stories that DeCamp was writing and the Carter was writing. And all suddenly he says, okay, you can do Conan. We don't have the rights to any particular stories, but you can do a Conan comic book for $200. And then I get panicky because where's this other $50 going to come from except out of my hide? If Martin Goodman suddenly remembers, about this $200 of the $150 that he offered, he's going to take out of my hide. I probably wouldn't have written the book because I read into superheroes and I was pretty busy and I was the associate editor of the company. So I was dealing, increasingly with writers and, a lot of different editorial responsibilities. I needed to get back that $50. I feel if I write the first issue or two and Martin Goodman says, I want my 50, where's my $50? You just gave away too much money. I could at least say, well, I'll write 2 or 3 pages for free. I don't know what my rate was, but I would have had to be 2 or 3 pages for free probably at that stage. But at least I could do that. So that's how I sort of backed my way into writing Conan. Otherwise, Jerry Conway or somebody else would probably have ended up with it.
Well, I'm sure that I speak on behalf of many fans when I say that I'm glad it was you, Roy. Now, speaking of the early days, initially, you didn't have the rights to adapt Howard's stories. And so you had to come up with your own original Conan narratives. Can you elaborate on that a little further?
Well, from the very beginning, I was going to do whatever I could legally do. So I just made up a story that in some ways it's a little like Frost Giant's Daughter in terms of setting, the same kind of people running around in the North. I just came up with a different story. And one of the things I did that was, I knew a lot of the readers who read it, if they've read Conan already and were familiar with it, and we were trying to reach those people, and there had to be hundreds of thousands of them out there by now, they would know that Conan's going to promote himself through the ranks and eventually become a king. They already knew that because the stories had been published. So I decided in the first issue, I was going to have him sort of building his own future, sort of including seeing himself crowned king of some civilized land. And I also planted one shot of Kull in there because I thought, well, if Conan turns out to be a hit, I'll go after Kull. Well, maybe we can do Kull too, because that was a nice little character, even though it's, very similar to Conan. So I wanted to establish Kull. And again, I checked these things with Glenn to make sure that he had no, objection. He thought that was fine. So, but otherwise, other than that, there wasn't anything particularly Hyborian in it, except the general milieu and the kind of people he was hanging around with. It wasn't until the second story that I really began to use any real Howard elements, because not in the Conan stories, but in his Hyborian Age essay, one of the things that most intrigued me about it early on was this story about how some generations or whatever in the past, as Howard is outlining this history of these several thousand years or whatever it is, that there were a bunch of warriors from the Aesir or somebody who went in to fight these sort of half-human apes that live in the North. They were like beast men of some sort or other. And they all went north and they never came back again. And that was all Howard says about it. It's just like one paragraph. I thought, well, we didn't have permission to adapt the Howard story, but I said to Glenn, hey, can I waste something on this one little paragraph of the Hyborian Age? He says, oh yeah, sure. Barry Smith drew it so they looked a little more like Planet of the Apes than I wanted it to. I wanted them to be a little more primitive and he has them almost looking like the Planet of the Apes things, but it looked good. So I kept that, and that was a nice story. Yeah, the next story I did was another story. It was the issue that became number 5 later on, I think. It was, I called it Zucala's Daughter. I got permission to use a character name from a Howard poem, Zucala, which is kind of a god figure, sort of turning into a wizard. Otherwise, the story was really kind of an original story on, Conan the way he encounters this sorcerer. I can't adapt the Conan story, but I can adapt a little of the Hyborian Age essay. Glenn says it's okay to use part of this poem, Zucala's Hour, and stick in a paragraph, a little bit of that. So now we're getting some actual Robert E. Howard into the comic books for the first time. And that was okay. And then I went whole hog after it. I decided, no, I'm good. So I said, look, we did this story that, it's like the guy the elephant getting the foot in the door, I guess. We did this story that's based on a Robert E. Howard story. How about we really adapt a real Conan story, but we'll pay extra for it? I got them to pay this little sum. And so we adapted Tower of the Elephant, which is both one of the earliest chronological Conan stories, the earliest, I guess, really official one, unless you count Frost Giant's Daughter, which people bounce back and forth. And it is also, happens to be, by sheer coincidence, my favorite Conan story, the one I like, the best, that I read the most often and prefer above all others. I've adapted it once in a color comic, once in a black and white comic, once in the Conan newspaper strip, and once on a record album with the old-time radio dramatic format. So I've adapted that story 4 times.
Oh, Tower of the Elephant's one of my all-time favorites. And you were actually one of the first to adapt it in a visual format. Let's talk about the artists, because you've partnered with some legendary titans of illustration over the years with the Conan series. I mean, you got John Buscema, you've got Ernie Chan, Barry Windsor Smith. Can you elaborate on your partnerships with these artists?
Stan and I knew exactly, we both agreed on exactly who should draw Conan the Barbarian. John Buscema. He was our first choice from the very beginning. I sent him copies of the book. He'd never heard of Conan, but he read it and loved it. Says, "This is the kind of stuff I've always wanted to do," because he hated doing, automobiles and planes and superheroes. He hated the Spider-Man character. He hated the Fantastic Four as characters, but he loved Conan. From the word go, he said, "This is the kind of stuff I want to do." Unfortunately, then we got the word from Martin Goodman, who apparently had somebody discovered this extra $50 somehow or other, and he said, "No, I got to get my money back on this. The money that you're paying. We can't have an expensive artist." And John Buscema would have been up there with Jack Kirby as one of the more. I mean, it was not like he was getting a king's ransom, but he was getting the highest page rate we had. He and Jack would have been right at the top. So he said, "You can't have that artist. You got to have somebody who's $10 or $20 a page cheaper or something like that. Maybe the rate, his top rate then maybe $40-$50 for a page of pencil, not inks, something like that." And not a lot of money. Again, like a few, a couple hundred or several hundred now, but it's still not a king's ransom. But we had to get somebody cheap. And my second choice would have been Gil Kane, who had been a fan of Conan long before I ever heard of the character, and would have loved to do it. And whom I talked over with it a lot. Sometimes, in fact, Gil convinced himself that he's the guy who taught me into doing Conan, but he had nothing to do with it. He was a cheerleader in my mind, but he was a very knowledgeable cheerleader. I had a friend. And I would have loved to either had him do it, but he was in a range that wasn't quite as high, but it was fairly high rate too. He's out of our range too, So Stan suggests a couple of other artists who were good, range veteran artists, and I said no. I said I don't want them. He says, "Why? You've worked with them before on books." And yeah, I said I know, but I said John Buscema or maybe Gil Kane, they would bring a special quality to Conan, and I feel that I would want to work with. These other guys would just be doing a comic book, and I think it wouldn't have any special quality like those two guys. I said, I gotta find somebody else. So Stan says, "Okay, but if you don't find somebody else that's acceptable and cheap, you got to use one of them." They were sort of middle range people. That was the highest we could afford. And I got to thinking, and in the meantime, I had done this story just on a lark for one of one called mystery books, a low-level horror book. I had with Barry Smith, who would briefly been in this country and then had to go back to England because they kicked him out because he didn't have a green card, I guess, or something like that. And so he's out there in the East End of London. We were trying to give him a little work. He was neither that good yet, though he had obviously a lot of talent and potential. And he's over there in England. So, I have to write him a letter or make a phone call that Marvel doesn't want to reimburse me for. They were very cheap in those days. And I came up with a story. It was just a 7 or 8 page story, which was a takeoff kind of on Conan and Thongor and that kind of character about a guy who I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a guy named Len Carson, a takeoff on the name Len Carter. Len Carson is this guy who's created a character called Star with 2 R's, Star the Slayer, who's obviously Conan or something like him. And he decides he's going to kill off that character. He's tired of writing. He's going to kill him off in the next story. And Star turns out to actually live in another dimension, kind of, and he comes into Earth and he kills his supposed creator, and he goes back to the other world. It's kind of a weird story with kind of paradoxes, but fairly simple and straightforward. And Barry drew this interesting-looking character with a strange helmet that has horns, but instead of being on the side, they're kind of in front, so he looks like a bull charging, which was kind of and so forth. And the funny thing is, so then I said, well, this guy Barry, he drew kind of an interesting story. This story that was just about then coming out in comics in Chamber of Darkness #4 and so forth. It just been intended as a throwaway story. It was not intended as a trial for Conan or the sword and sorcery stuff or anything. But then, he might do it. He's the cheapest artist we have. I said he's over there in English, get like $20 a page. That's our lowest starting rate. He's over there in England. He's looking for work. We'll give him this. He can do it. See if he wants to do it. So I call him up and tell him I send him that story that I had already done for John Buscema, and so forth. And said, yeah, I'll do it. So he does it. And the next thing you know, he really falls in love with it too. And so we produced the next couple of dozen issues of Conan together until he left, of his own volition. But he got the job as kind of a third choice. But, in a little while, he obviously wouldn't have been anybody's second choice. As far as I was concerned, he could have stayed with Conan forever. But, he had other ambitions, so he left after a while.
So there have been moments in Marvel Comics history where Conan has crossed over and interacted with modern Marvel heroes such as Doctor Strange, Venom, Wolverine, like right here. You have a very strong opinion on this matter. Tell us about it.
I don't want to see Conan crossover with the Marvel or any other universe, and I would not allow it when I was there. The closest thing that ever came was when I did a what if story with Conan. And I think Peter Parker was in never interacting with Conan, but just like as a background character or something. And that was the closest I would ever come. I had a lot of different people after a year or two when Conan was a hit, wanting to do this or that with Conan or have him, and I said no. The closest I ever came to doing anything with the heroes was the first issue of Conan sold pretty well, and I don't remember the exact figure, but it was a good figure with a low print run, but it's a respectable, good figure. Every one of the next 7 issues sold less well than the one before it, which is not a good sign, right? By the time of issue number 7, the book was actually canceled for one day. Stan decided to cancel it, not because it was a total loser that he had to cancel, but for the worst reason in the world, as I explained to my mentor, which is he wanted to get Barry to draw something else. He said, Barry's getting pretty good after, and so forth. And he said, I think Barry would want to stay on Conan, but since Conan's not going anywhere, if I kill Conan, if we just kill the Conan book, then Barry won't mind, he'll go off and do something else. I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. If you don't feel that Barry and I can sell the book together, or you feel you want Barry on something else, tell him he's no longer the artist. Take him off something else. Put him on something else. I'll miss him, but you're the boss. But don't kill the books to get rid of the artist. That it's like it's a backward way to do something. So we finally agreed. Okay, so we somehow the book kind of survived, and Stan saved the book actually by suggesting. He said, "I've been looking at these covers." He said, because Stan had to approve all the covers eventually, but I was kind of handling them at that stage. Basically otherwise, and he hadn't been paying too much attention, and there were nice covers, but he said, you got too many damn animals on these covers. He said, you got, the Beastmen's okay, they look kind of human, you got this big god figure, but then he's fighting a spider on one cover, he's fighting a woman who changed into a tiger, not even a man who changed into a woman who changed into a tiger, and there was a snake with a man's head, and so forth. He says, get rid of these damn animals, get some human-looking menaces on the cover. Well, by coincidence, the next issue, number 8, was one that was based on with Glenn's arrangement with Glenn Lord again, which was based on a Howard synopsis that had been turned into a story by DeCamp, maybe with Carter, but we didn't have the right to do that. But Glenn said, well, I think you do have the right to take that same synopsis and turn it into a different story. So we did. And it has 2 things in it, by the way it ended up, our version of it, which is quite different from what DeCamp wrote, but in terms of what the creatures were. There are two threats to Conan in it. One of them is a giant, what Howard called the guardian of the city, which Barry decided to draw like a giant Gila monster, an animal. And the other thing is there are like 3, I think, giant, like 7 or 8 foot skeletons in armor, kind of skeletal warriors. Well, with Stan's direction there, we knew which one we were going to use as the cover. We're not going to use the Gila monster. We're going to throw in, and that's the first issue after number 1 where the sales went up. And the next issue, we adapted a non-Conan story. What was it called? The Garden of Fear, I think. Yeah, with a bat-winged guy ruling in a tower over this lost valley. That at least had a human with wings, so we probably would have done that anyway. But between Stan's advice, a guy who always said, I don't know what the hell sword and sorcery is. He never even read any of the stuff. He didn't even read the Conan comics ever. And so, but he saved the book because of his innate good sense as an editor of saying that, get rid of those animals, get some human menaces on the cover. And after that, when 8 and 9 began to climb, it was a steady climb. And from then on to the end, it was always holding or getting better in sales under Barry and me. And I was kind of pleased with that because, we need a little help from Stan to push us in the right direction. But eventually people caught on. It just, sometimes, a book just takes a little while to get caught. It took us 7 or 8 issues to kind of, it's not that those other issues at the beginning aren't just as good or better. One of them is Tower of the Elephant. One is an adaptation of the story with the man-headed serpent, we took and kind of extended. And I'm really proud of those stories, but they just didn't sell as well. But and all we had to do was make a few little changes, and we suddenly had a hit on our hands. Never a huge hit, but it was getting better and better. And it soon went back to being monthly with Barry as the artist, just in time for him to decide to quit it.
Well, Barry was amazing, but so were all the legendary artists that followed him. And speaking of that, many of them got their chance to portray Conan in their own style in the pages of Savage Sword of Conan. Let's talk about the inception of Savage Sword. I know it has a lot to do with Comic Code Authority, but it's also just a really fun, legendary project.
Stan loved the idea of getting into that black and white market to compete with like James Warren's is creepy and eerie and other things of that sort, and to get away from the comics code, do a little more adult comics. He was looking to expand. This was in like 1970, 71, right about the time Conan #1 came out. Talked the publisher into doing a big comic, black and white comic without the code seal called, Savage Tales. And at first, Cole was going to be the star of it, but when the Conan ́1 came in about that time, selling pretty well, he made Conan the star of it instead, which I think was a much better idea. Jerry Conway was already working on a Cole story that I had asked him to do. That just went on the shelf. I called up Barry, and he had the Conan books. We talked over the Frost Giant's Daughter, and after a 5-10 minute phone conversation, then he drew that little 11, 12, whatever page adaptation of Frost Giant's Daughter. It was already drawn, and then I put in the dialogue and so forth, and that was pretty good. But then Goodman killed the book because he didn't really want to be in that market that much. And when Stan became the publisher in 1972, he revived it as Savage Tales. And I convinced him to turn it into an all Robert E. Howard book. He wasn't sure what to do with it. And I said, well, those other characters, the Man Thing's already doing something else now, and Khazar's a different kind of character. Why don't we why don't you just have me just handled as a Robert E. Howard book? We just use Conan and Cull and things like that. And he said, okay, because then he knew I'd handle it all. He wouldn't have to think about it again, except for the covers and so forth. And it sold pretty well. It did very well. It took us a couple of issues to kind of get going. Barry and I did this adaptation of Randales, which was just wonderful. And then Stan decided, I don't know why, but instead of staying with Savage Tales, he just called me in one day. He never explained his thought processes to me. Sometimes, maybe I could figure them out. This time, I'm not sure. He said, instead of just going on with Savage Tales this way, we should start a new book. It's just devoted to Conan. We'll take Savage Tales and turn that over to Khazar and maybe have a couple of backup features, things like that. And I said, well, okay, so got to have a title. And I came up, with Savage Sword of Conan, which was partly based on one of the Gnome Press books was Sword of Conan. I took most of the titles for the Conan comics from the Gnome Press things that came out in the 50s, those hardcovers that Martin Greenberg published, because they weren't using those titles on the paperbacks. I didn't want to repeat a title for the paperback like Conan the Adventurer or whatever, But some of the titles of the Martin Greenberg books, the Gnome Press books, were Conan the Barbarian, Sword of Conan, and King Conan, and so forth. So I had taken Conan the Barbarian for once, and now I said I'd take the Sword of Conan, but to make it a little stronger, I took that word savage from Savage Tales, and we put that on there to kind of carry over from Savage Tales. So we had the Savage Sword of Conan I suggested for the title. Instead said, you're getting better at these titles. That's good. That's all right. So we started over, and he mostly, left me alone to do that book. And I proceeded with help. And then after I left, other people carried on to make it easily, I think, one of the most successful black and white comics in terms of longevity ever. 235 issues, not counting a few specials. How many black and white comic books in America ever lasted 235 issues? Very few. I mean, I don't think Phoebe or Erie or those things lasted that long in their original incarnation. So it was pretty much of a success from the word go.
Man, those original Savage Sword issues really hold up. I just read your Red Nails adaptation the other night. It's fantastic. Can you give me more of an idea of what the working atmosphere was like on Savage Sword? Were you all working in the same location together? Just give me a few snapshot memories of that time.
Yeah, well, Barry was originally over there in England, but he wanted to come back to the States. So I remember the 7th issue, the one that adapted that, it's called The Lurker. What's the name? The God in the Barrel. That's the name of that little story that wasn't even published during Howard's lifetime. Barry and I, in a hotel in London where my first wife and I were staying, and we were with Barry and his girlfriend. And Barry and I were in there being stared at by these other people in the sort of big outer space of the hotel, where guests would kind of gather. And they're sitting around. And, Stan was famous for jumping around on furniture, to show artists points of what he would do. I was not like that. I'm not that demonstrative, but Barry was. So I'm sitting there, we're talking about, it's like the opposite of Stan and Jack. I'm sitting there talking about the story, and Barry's jumping around the furniture, pretending to be the guy with the sword. And these people are like we're insane, because we had the God in the Bowl is such a thin story. There's not that much that happens. So I turned one of the women, I had the idea to turn one of the people into a woman, so we'd have a female presence for the guys to look at. And we expanded it, so instead of him just cutting off the head of that creature, he has to fight it for several pages first. And Barry turned that into a real tour de force. And so we added a lot to it. And we came up with a new story, which is why I retitled it, because it wasn't quite the same story, but it's still Howard's story. And anyway, but we wanted to get Barry back, and pretty soon Barry was able to get back to the States. And after that, we just kind of talked over the ideas there. But we mostly worked alone. I mean, Barry and I would get together and talk over the stories. A lot of the early ones I just wrote out. I even for Tower of the Elephant, I wrote a 3 or 4 page plot. Plus, he was reading the story. He sort of my notes on how to adapt it, I felt, or what he should do, and so forth. And some of the stories, of course, were total originals, and so forth. And I would do a several page story, and he would just draw it. He'd add a few things here or there, certainly expand it in telling, and do a beautiful job of it. We got along, pretty well. And then he got back to the States somewhere in the middle of there. And at that stage, I don't know, I think he just began to feel like he wanted to do something else. So after that first, few dozen or a little more than a dozen issues, he suddenly announced to me he was quitting Conan and everything because he wanted to do other stuff. I said, okay. So I said, well, by this time, I don't know why we didn't go back to John Buscema, who was our first choice, but Gil Kane, I felt, well, Gil Kane was such a rooter for it, such a big fan. I said, he really wanted to do it, so I gave him a shot at it. He was going to be the regular artist, but after 2 issues, he was going, I heard him, he told some artists, Roy wants me to draw a goddamn epic every month. Well, of course I did. Barry had been drawing an epic every month and putting, increasing amount of drawing, good drawing and interesting drawing. You can't go from that to just a regular comic book style or you're going to lose your readers and so forth. So I said, yeah, you have to really put a lot in. And Gil just discovered he did a great job and those issues sold quite well, but it was just too much work for him. He had an ex-wife to support, So he decided to quit. So and by a weird stroke of circumstance, it's almost exactly the same time that Gil told me that he wanted to quit. But I said, I kind of miss Conan and everything. I'd like to come back if it's ever available. I says, well, funny you should ask. Gil just told me to them yesterday, that he wants out. And again, we'd have probably gone to Buscema. But if Barry wanted to come back, Barry was so great. So we did. We came back. He did another handful of issues. And then he decided to quit again. And that's when Stan got worried. Because by now, Conan was becoming a pretty good seller. Not just the Barry issues, but also the 2 Gil Kane issues. And it was obvious that it was, a hit. And he calls me into his office because, we'd been winning awards, from the fans and a couple of professional awards from our ACMA Society. And he calls me and he says to me, Barry says he's going to quit again, huh? I said, yeah. He says, what do you think will happen to Conan when Barry quits? I said, I thought a second, says, I think we'll win fewer awards and sell more comic books. And I said that because I was going to put John Buscema on it, and I felt as good as Barry was, and he was great, I felt that John Buscema doing Conan would be more commercial to those few people to whom Barry was still a little off-putting, a little sophisticated, a little bit, Art Nouveau-ish or something. And I said, I didn't explain it. I said, I think we'll win fewer awards and sell more comics. So that's exactly what we did. We won fewer awards, we sold more comics. And in the next year or two, Conan had become, one of Marvel's handful of best-selling, titles. So Stan wanted to do this, black and white book, Savage Sword of Conan. So, of course, as usual, we didn't get to start off with a story that should have started off Savage Sword of Conan #1, because that was going to be the adaptation of Black Colossus, that John penciled that I gave to Alfredo Alcala to ink. But whenever Marvel put a book on the schedule, it was always already late. It's just the way he did things. And we didn't have time to get a 30-page story, drawn new. So we had to take one of the color issues that was ready to go out of order and take it and plop it into black and white, which didn't look that good. We could add a few gray tones, but it wasn't really meant to be in a black and white book. So it's not a great choice for the first issue. But we had a really good cover by Boris Vallejo, who had a nice Frazetta kind of feel. And, we threw Red Sonia in as a backup feature with Esteban Maroto and so forth. And we had a pretty good run. And then, as I said, then there were, 234 more to go, of which I wrote about, I don't know, I must have written about half of them. I wrote the first 60, and a couple others they threw in a little later, and then I came back and wrote the last, 30 or so. So I guess I wrote about half the issues of Savage Sword at both ends.
Well, Savage Sword was also a great way to introduce audiences to other Howard characters. Now, Cole had his own comic line, but, in the pages of Savage Sword, characters such as Solomon Kane pop up. What was your approach to adapting these other Howard characters, and do you have a favorite?
I don't know if I have an exact favorite. I certainly liked Cull because I thought he was like Conan, but you could make it a little different if you wanted to, because I didn't want to keep him as a king all the time. Kings are kind of dull. Every time Conan was a king in the story, they had to overthrow him and he has to get his crown back, and they did that, in 3 different stories, but you can't go on doing it forever. So we would sometimes do stories about Cull during his younger days because Howard had said what that would be. That was a lot of fun. I never cared. I like him reading his stories, but I was never a fan particularly, and I certainly did not enjoy writing Solomon Kane. Though I wrote Solomon Kane, and I did a story or two with Howard Chaykin and a couple other people. I think they turned out all right, but I never really liked Solomon Kane or working with him, and that was the least interesting to me. Other people, it's a favorite, And I liked Bran McMorn, but we just did the 1 or 2 story. Barry had started that one adaptation of Worms of the Earth, and when he dropped off, Tim Conrad finished it in a similar style, and I think that worked out beautifully.
Let's talk about Red Sonia. She's very loosely based on a Howard character, but they don't share a whole lot in common. And the Red Sonia that most people know, the one that you created, is kind of its own thing. So tell us about the creation of this iconic character and companion to Conan.
Sonia was weird because it's hard to believe sometimes how things fall together. I had already decided not only that I wanted Conan to have a sometime, not regular, but sometime female foil, not a girlfriend, but a woman who was a warrior that could hold her own with him more or less, that kind of thing. I had already decided that. Not only that, I had decided on her hair color. I had decided I wanted her to be a redhead because there are 2 warrior women in the Conan stories by Howard. One was Belit, whom he would meet, who's dark-haired, and one was Lyria, whom we would meet later, who's blonde. So I decided I was going to make up a red-headed character. I have a feeling I would have called her, the name was floating around in my head, probably even then, Crimza with a K, and so forth. That was really good because it's based on the word crimson. It would be kind of an obvious kind of title. And then suddenly, and I knew nothing about Red Sonia, never heard of her. And then one day I'm reading an article in one of those collections of the Amra fanzine. Remember those? You see that, they did 2 hardcover collections from Amra, the Conan Sword Book and the Conan Reader. And one of them, the first one, I think, Conan Reader, has an article in it called Conan on Crusade. by a guy named Alan Howard, no relation to Robert E., evidently. And it's about the Conan Crusader type stories, the ones that took place during the Crusades or a little later. 2 or 3, with Cormac McCaffrey or whatever his name was there. And it was kind of interesting. But in that, the fourth of those, again, I wasn't reading the stories. I'm just reading an article about the stories. Alan Howard mentions that in one of these stories, there's a story called The Shadow of the Vulture. And there's a character in it. He says the hero is a German knight named von Kalmbach, and it takes place like in the 14th, 15th century during the siege of Vienna by the Turks. And in addition to von Kalmbach, there's also a supporting character who he doesn't say the name. He just says it's a Russian she-cat who might have been a good companion for Conan. In fact, he says she might have been too much for him. Well, that kind of intrigued me. Suddenly I find that there's a redheaded woman in some story that somebody says might make a good companion for Conan. And again, the house falls on me. So I probably called this case, because I was a Harry Glenn Lord in Texas. We were on good terms. And I said, what's this Shadow of the Vulture thing with this Russian she-cat with red hair or whatever, that might have been good for Conan? He goes, oh, yeah, that's the character Red Sonia. She's in this story. He says, it's never been reprinted, It was printed back in the 30s, and was it called Golden Fleece or Magic Carpet? Then was that magazine had both names, and it was in one of those issues, but it's never been reprinted since the 30s. But I got he had copies of all this. He had photo magazines. He just made photocopies of the story, and he mailed it to me right away. And I read this up. Oh, this is great. Von Kalmbach can easily become Conan. And this Red Sonia character is really, there's not that much to her. She's just a mean hellcat. She fights a little bit. She saves his life a time or two. And this Red Sonia is spelled with a Y, Sony. And she's in the story, she's like the sister of another woman named Sophia, I think, who was actually maybe an historical character. But anyway, Sonia was not, obviously. And I thought, well, that's kind of nice. I thought, can we do this? I said, yeah, can we adapt it? Yeah, that'll be fine. So I did, but I said I didn't want to just use Red Sonia exactly as she was anywhere that I was using von Kalmbach. So I said, I want to change the spelling. I said, so I changed the spelling of Sonia to Sonia with a J, so there was this little differentiation between the Straight Howard character and the Conan version of it. And we put that out, and it became, and again, she was popular from the beginning, and Barry, that was Barry's second from last story, The Shadow of the Vulture, which was really a wonderful story. The only mistake, I think we should have adapted it to 2 issues, probably, and spread it out instead of squeezing it into 1, but it made a good issue. And then we came up with this plot together for another story with Red Sonia that I called The Ballad of Red Sonia, which was sort of finished up both what her mission was, why she was in this doomed, besieged city. And that was kind of fun, and so forth. And Ballad, it was my basic idea, but he added some things to the plot because I wanted it had to do with Kull even too, the Kull's and the Serpent Men stuff, and this crown and so forth. And she gets the better of Conan and rides off because I did not want Conan to have any regular girlfriend or companion. I just wanted her to be somebody who moves away and maybe I'll run into her again if she's popular or something. And so as it turns out, Barry and Red Sonia wrote out of the comics at exactly the same time, and John Buscema wrote in with the next issue, and the book sales went even higher.
And of course, as we all know, Red Sonia went on to find great success. She got her own movie in the 80s with Arnold playing kind of Conan. But just another thing, folks, Heroic Signatures has nothing to do with Red Sonia today, but we wish her all the best. Let's talk, speaking of movies, about the 1982 Arnold Schwarzenegger film, Conan the Barbarian, because I happen to know that you wrote one of the initial screenplays for that film. And from what I hear, it's entirely different. So what was your take on the movie, and what's the history behind that?
It was a friend of mine who ran the Super Snipe comic store just a few blocks from where I lived on East 86th Street in Manhattan. His name was Ed Summer. His silent partner was a guy named George Lucas, which is how I met that and became involved in Star Wars a little later. It was several years before Star Wars, though. And Ed liked the comics. He loved Conan and everything. We became friends and went to movies together and so forth. And Ed had gone to And he knew Ed Pressman, who was a movie producer. And he came from the Pressman toy family, which had a lot of money. And he went to a movie with Pressman. They went to a screening of Pumping Iron, with Schwarzenegger and Ferrigno and so forth, about the the bodybuilders. And evidently Pressman said to him, says, boy, that Schwarzenegger, he's got something. He told us just right away afterward. So he's got something. He's says, I'd like to find a property for him. And Ed Summer turns to him and says, well, what about Conan the Barbarian? And Ed says, of course, who? Because, nobody's, if these guys don't read, if it's in a comic book or a paperback book, it's got to be in a movie or TV series if they don't know it exists. So Ed explained to him what Conan was. And that's sort of what led to Conan Properties Incorporated being created, because Ed came to me and he said, well, Ed Pressman says he'd like to deal with these people. I said, well, you got a problem. Glenn Lawrence is the literary agent. Elsbeth DeCamp holds certain other rights, and they hate each other. So I said, but all I can do is introduce. I said, I'm on decent enough terms with both of them, especially Glenn. But I said, so I from my apartment while he's sitting there, are you still there? Yeah, okay. We just lost your side for a second. I called Glenn down in Pasadena. I introduced Glenn to Ed, and the next thing out of this comes Conan Properties Incorporated and the whole idea of a Conan movie. That all came out of that, and so Ed and I were going to write. I'm sorry, we did the story. Ed and I were going to write the first movie. We were hoping to write the first movie, and so Ed had a vague idea for a story. I think it owed a little bit to Rogues in the House. Had certain scenes, especially the one where Conan was in bed with a girl, and then he runs to the door and knocks himself out because he's drunk and so forth. I know that scene was in there, but it also, but from then on, it veered into something else. We worked it out, and we wrote a proposal, and we were paid. I think my share of it, became something like about, just a few $100 or something. Really, it wasn't very much. And it was obvious eventually we probably weren't going to be the real writers. They were going to have to get some, major screenwriter or something like that to do it. But we were involved. That was the very first Conan thing, and it sort of helped get the project started. But then, of course, it got out of our hands, and that was the end of that for that particular movie, except that I was signed to be the story consultant for the first movie to advise John Milius when he was hired, to do it. And so I had like one meeting or so with John Milius, which we talked a little bit, and I took some notes, and I sent him back about 10 or 20 pages of notes on our conversation and ideas coming out of it. And by that time, he'd read 2 or 3, 4 of the Conan stories. He decided he knew everything he was, so I never heard from him again. But in the meantime, I had signed this contract with Ed Pressman for like $10,000 to be the story consultant. Unfortunately, it didn't guarantee me any screen credit, so I don't have a screen credit on the movie because my contract, that part of my contract wasn't worth the paper it wasn't printed on, But I got my $10,000, and for a day or two of work, that isn't so bad. I'll take that anytime I can get it.
Roy, let's get brutal here. Let's be honest. What is your take on that movie?
I guess Conan the Barbarian is a classic, but I think it's a rather dull classic that needed to have a lot of goosing up to make it a really good movie. And certain parts of it, I think, were totally non-Conan. God, his owner had to drive him off into the wilderness. Conan killed his slave masters. You didn't have to drive Conan into the wilderness. I mean, there were some things where Lewis was just so far off, it was painful. And so maybe I shouldn't wish for it. And at the same time, he was a talented filmmaker, and the movie has a seriousness which the second movie didn't have. But at the same time, it's really not any better a Conan, I don't think, except for the fact that Conan's pretty good. Schwarzenegger's Conan's pretty good.
I mean, Arnold was great. But at the time you were writing that early draft, did you envision any other actors taking on that role?
No, I do know two people that were considered by Pressman besides Arnold. He obviously Arnold was what got it started, but he had 2 other people in mind. I know if they decided to start with a King Conan, and there was some thought they might. Howard started with King Conan, right? So maybe it was going to be Charles Bronson, who's not a big guy, but he could have been made. He would have had the right feel, and I think that John Buscema sometimes said he thought about Bronson a little, and so forth. The other person who was the for the young Conan. There was one other person that evidently, if something had happened with Schwarzenegger, he was also in the ring. There have been others. This is only, but I heard about this directly from Ed Summer, who was sort of a assistant producer on the movie. There was one other guy. He'd only been in one little movie, and he had another movie in the works, but it hadn't come out yet. His name was Sylvester Stallone. He'd been in a movie that just came out called The Lords of Flatbush, and he had some good notice of that movie. Rocky was not made. You heard of Rocky? We're talking 1966.
Yo, crap! Up in the mountain up there. It's me, Conan the Barbarian. You gonna give me some cards or what?
That would be a strong Sumerian accent, wouldn't it?
That would have been something. Well, the future is limitless. What would you like to see happen in the next Conan movie?
They should throw caution to the wind and actually try to adapt a Conan story or put 2 or 3 of them together in some way. If they're not going to do, say, the Hour of the Dragon, at least, put a couple of movies together. Forget what's been done before, just like they did when they did the third Conan, the second Conan the Barbarian movie, the third Conan movie, which, again, had a little better sorcery in it in some ways, but also was just not a good movie. And had Conan have yet another origin. Conan doesn't need an origin. People keep giving Conan an origin. He grew up in there. He came south. He doesn't need to reel of pain. That was kind of an interesting image. He didn't need to be kicked out. He didn't need to be a pit fighter, though that wasn't too bad. Whatever it was they spent 20 or 30 minutes in the third movie doing, he didn't need any of that either. He just needs to be this guy that erupts on the screen, whether as a king or a young thief in the what was it called, the City of Thieves. I think I need maybe find a young Conan and make him and have him go through the Tower of the Elephant. There's a couple of little elements of Tower of the Elephants in there, the Tower of the Serpent. And I think one of the few things that I suggested, I said, make that a real, call it the Tower of the Serpent or something. I was trying to get a little feeling more of Howard in there because I didn't feel the movie really had it. They had a villain who's named after a Kull villain, Thulsa Doom, who doesn't do anything except turn a snake into an arrow or turn himself into a snake. I felt there was just so little sorcery in that movie. But I do remember, but they did have the giant serpent, which it wasn't a giant spider, but it's a giant serpent. I remember telling Ed Pressman, the producer, when I saw him later, I said, Ed, that fight with that giant snake is pretty good, but it's kind of short. He says, listen, we used every piece of footage we had. He said, hey, we had nothing else, so we had no more decent shots. It could have been 3 seconds longer. That was all we could do. And that was pretty good. But after that, there's very little sorcery in the movie. And it has a nice feel to it, a nice tone, but it's not a good sword and sorcery story. The second movie, they threw in a lot of sword and sorcery, but they lost the tone of the stuff. Once we were off the picture, and particularly, they made it increasingly comical, and you got to take off on The Price is Right or something in there. I mean, just stuff that made me cringe. So the only good thing about the second movie was Jerry Conway and I had suggested this, that for the character we had made up of this black Amazon called Zula, we had suggested that Grace Jones, that was more Jerry's idea than mine, Grace Jones would be a good person to do it. And we happened to be lucky enough to be sitting with then producer Dino De Laurentiis and the casting person, who was Jane Feinberg of the very big consulting firm, casting firm at the time, Fenton and Feinberg. And when she heard Jerry talk about, Grace Jones, he said, we've been looking for something for her. That she would be great. So the next thing, she's got the part. She has no idea who suggested her, but I think that, and that scene where she's introduced is really great. But otherwise, the second movie wasn't as good as the first, and the first had a lot of problems. So I don't ever think there's been a good Conan movie. I think they need to go back to the source. They were scared because before Conan the Barbarian, there'd been that movie. What was it called? Was it the Sword and the Sorcerer or something like that? Or there was something like that. It started several things from the Conan stories. The whole idea, I remember, of the sorcerer gesturing and the heart of somebody comes into his hand. And that was a swipe from something in Hour of the Dragon, I think. And really swiped a lot of stuff. And I think they got kind of scared off. It's just like when Jerry and I wanted to put a giant spider into our movie, the one that became Conan the Destroyer. We were told we couldn't do it because there was this producer had told us about this movie going to come out for, was it Paramount? I don't remember who it was. It was going to be the greatest sword and sorcery movie of all time. It turned out it was Crawl, which was not the greatest sword and sorcery movie of all time, but it had a giant crystal spider. It had a giant crystal spider in it. So it was our spider. We put in something else, And I think they should just, at this stage, throw caution to the winds and just, do something, find a way to tie together 2 or 3 Conan stories, of his young Conan or middle-aged Conan, or do Hour of the Dragon. Get Arnold Schwarzenegger in there. So King Conan was only 30 or 50 years old at the most, at the time of Hour of the Dragon, and Arnold's like in his 70s or whatever. But if he's in good enough shape to play this, he could play 50, 60. Have him do Hour of the Dragon. He's the king. He gets overthrown. He has to regain his crown. That would be a good movie. You could do that once.
Well, you certainly have that recipe locked down for what makes a good cinematic story, because many of the iconic characters that you created went on to find great success in the MCU.
The reason the Marvel movies were so successful when Marvel Studios started doing them, even when they were doing, before that, the Spider-Man and X-Men movies, the reason they succeeded where some of the earlier movies and TV shows using the Marvel characters didn't work is because they were done by people with a respect for the original material. The Spider-Man movies had the feel of the Spider-Man comic book to a great extent. The X-Men movies have the feel of the Chris Claremont X-Men, that second X-Men revival that Chris Claremont was doing with Dave Cockrum and John Byrne, and we were good for that reason. I couldn't follow them, but then I could never follow Chris's plots either. So, they had that same kind of complexity, the same kind of wonderful feel, and they did very well. And when Marvel Studios started going, and they started going for the Avengers, they got the feel of the Avengers. They changed things. Jarvis becomes a voice instead of a guy, and different things. But basically, Iron Man was Iron Man, and Thor was Thor, and the Hulk was the Hulk before he became that stupid Professor Hulk thing. And Captain America was Captain America. And they put them all together. And the Vision and Ultron, when they used my characters, they found the essence of those characters and put them out. And it's only when they begin to go away from that they lose their way, because they think that there's a feeling in Hollywood where I worked, doing those movies for a few years. And I saw this with Kenny Johnson, the guy who did that first Hulk pilot too for TV, whom I met a time or two. If you adapt something and it turns out to be really good, but it was good in the first place, well, that doesn't reflect too much on you, because after all, it was a good property. You turned something into Gone with the Wind, but it was already Gone with the Wind, But if you can say that something was a piece of crap, like Kenny Johnson thought the Hulk was, if you can say something was a piece of crap, but I turned it into something great, I didn't pay attention to the comic book, Kenny Johnson told me. He says, or said in interviews, I read, he said, I went to things like Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde, and I was thinking, what the hell did you think Jack Kirby and Stan Lee did? They went to Jekyll and Hyde, and the same 2 sources. These people have to feel they're rediscovering the wheel in order to convince themselves that they're geniuses.
I have to mention your cameo in Daredevil. I saw you in that. You're pretty good. You got acting chops, man.
I was just very happy to do it. They gave me a choice of being in Daredevil or Iron Fist and Cage. And I'd had a hand in the creation of Iron Fist and Cage, but Daredevil was going to shoot first. And I said, I don't know how much longer this stuff's going to go on. So I jumped at Daredevil. I'm glad, because I don't think I'd have made it into anything if I'd waited for the other 2. I had fun being in there. I was in my little prison, in a real prison. Had been a real prison. It was damp and cold because it's been raining, and one of the extras, the one who was sitting opposite me, went out and slipped in a puddle of water and practically broke her leg. Exciting shoot.
Well, maybe we can get you in the next Conan movie. We got to get that Roy Thomas cameo, man.
I'd play the guy that gets trampled by Conan's horse. That's what I'd be. I'd be the guy. That'd be my line.
Perfect. Cut to tape. You're in the movie. Well, that's the perfect note to end on, Roy. Thank you so much for your time. This was an absolute honor.
Thank you very much. It's been fun. I wish you guys good luck.
Guys, Roy Thomas, the legend. Let us know in the comments, what is your favorite Roy Thomas Savage Sword story? What is your favorite old school Marvel Conan story? Who would you like to see us interview on the show next? Please like and subscribe. I am Sean Curley. I'm back for more next time.